Okay, so this is going to be an introduction for Chapter 1 for Information System Security. So we're going to, at the introduction here, we're going to be talking about a couple broad topics. First thing we're going to talk about here is this concept of a cyber threat analysis. All right, so a couple things we're going to talk about, and some things we cover in this. Define and understand cyber operational threat environments, identify different classes of cyber attacks, identify and understand general cyber attack stages, right? Basically, kind of what happens, how they happen in the world. So, so hacking has actually been around for some period of time. It's not necessarily a new thing. We actually saw kind of the first generation of stuff in the 70s, which was really that was a different, obviously, a clearly a different time period in terms of computing. Um, you know, really driven by mainframe computing. There's some mini computers, but for the most part, it was like large corporate um, data centers. So there wasn't a large what we call attack surface for organizations for that organizations had to protect. So there was a lot of work. The early stuff that was in the 70s were kind of driven by a kind of an analysis and just kind of kind of try to educate what potential threats could be. The second generation though is where we saw really kind of in the 80s where we started seeing kind of with the introduction of PCs and kind of the networking and being connecting things together. There was really we saw more of a real trend of hacking. We started to see kind of different approaches, different techniques for it. Through the early 80s all through into the 90s. Third generation we would probably categorize as the 90s, tied by you know part of it partly driven by the rise of the internet. Um, Also, the curiosity. Basically, you saw a lot of um, growth of hacker communities and kind of a hacker culture. This idea of being able to develop techniques and be able to share techniques. And then really what we've seen is from about 2000 on is really the driven by this idea of a cyber crime because quite frankly that's where commerce has gone, that's where social networks have gone. So we're seeing kind of a convergence of what you would consider to be criminal activities combined with intelligence activities combined with political activities, and also within that, also probably within that also domain, this idea of cyber warfare. So this has been evolving over the past uh, 19 years or so, which is really the world we're in right now. There's a lot of different types of threats, right? So we're not um, threats come in all sorts of different forms. Most times these days, there's a couple major components. First, we have something called script kiddies, which is really being able to people who go out and will search the internet, find information around well-known vulnerabilities, well-known hacking techniques, um, and be able to go out and just hack. Be go out and look for vulnerabilities and attack systems of that nature. Um, this is they can be pretty effective. So a lot of the attacks are out there have been pretty well documented. Um, so it's not like people were creating a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff is just basically they're able to do it themselves. Like if you go out to GitHub, you could download different types uh, of packages which can be used to basically build your own hacking techniques or hacking kit. So the script kiddies is kind of the lowest level. Organized crime, we're seeing more and more, the idea of using of criminal activities because that's where money is at. That's where commerce is at. So you're seeing, trying to, do things like interrupt e-commerce applications, being able to capture things like, personal information, um, and being able to leverage it for, basically for identity theft and other types of things. Because quite frankly, if you're doing all of your business activities on the computer, and if you can compromise identities or, you know, charge numbers, PIN numbers, things of that nature, you can be able to leverage that for really some pretty significant financial gain. And we've also seen, this has probably been within probably about the past 10 years or so, I would categorize it as, this idea of a nation state sponsored cyber attack. So we're seeing, nations like Russia and China and North Korea um, being involved, or focusing a lot of their efforts and research, into this sort of cyber threat world. And, conversely, the United States, Western Bloc, has also invested a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of research into this area. So this idea of, focusing on both on strategic and tactical uh, modes of operation. So we're seeing these kind of three broad um, threat types that security professionals have to understand and deal with. The difference between kind of a hacker and a cyber criminal. You could argue this could be a little semantic, but this idea of you have low levels, low level hackers basically looking for social engineering attacks or uh, insiders, disgruntled employees. They one of the things, even though they might be low level, disgruntled employees represent a pretty significant threat um, environment or potential threat environment to an organization. Um, because they are on the inside, they have access to things. More sophisticated, we're seeing, sophisticated hackers, organized crime, um, you know, an interesting kind of a world out here. Unethical security guys, basically people who've gone from white hat, as basically which we refer to the good guys, over to black hat or the gray hat, which is kind of what we refer to as being um, on the bad guy side. And then specifically, what we've seen is this industrial espionage terrorism kind of mode. Seen a lot of it in interactions between um, Russia and their former Soviet bloc. So there's been a lot of activity with between Ukraine, um, and Russia, and also Georgia and other some areas like the Baltic states. I mean, one of the things Russia has done is invested a lot of effort, a lot of energy, into being able to uh, use cyber, you know, as using cyber as a means of, establishing a political positioning, or their kind of, basically their position, establishing themselves as a threat to other countries. So we're seeing, foreign espionage, state-sponsored attacks, terrorist groups. These are all things that we've have not really seen. The full breadth and depth of what the potential of this could be has not been fully realized yet. But in looking at it, you can get a sense of where this could be, or where it could potentially end up at. A couple different classes. So when we talk about cyber attacks, a couple different ways we look at this. First we have passive, which is basically listening. Basically you plug in and monitor traffic. There's a lot of information that can be picked up. You don't have to be overtly looking to penetrate resources. Especially with the networking, if you can position yourself um, to simply listen and capture information. Um, it's actually, if somebody is not aware of that, information is being captured. There's a lot of valuable information, that could be gleaned from just sitting and listening. Especially if you're dealing with non-encrypted traffic, or weakly encrypted traffic. Things that does not have a high enough degree of encryption on it. Um, Active attacks, basically, act, attacker will try to bypass, or into the secured environment. So by circumventing, breaking the protection features, the idea of introducing malicious code or modify information in an environment. But basically, this is going to be where you see an overt um, an approach to, and you can do is you can actually see combinations. An attack can take the form of you're starting off with, say, passive collecting information as an initial phase, and then transitioning over to an active phase where you can leverage the information that's been captured through the passive during the passive uh, time window. Insiders, you know, stealing, damaging information, a lot of valuable information, you know, or pass through people's hands in an organization, and that could be, quite frankly, used as used as an attack mechanism by somebody who is either disgruntled or perhaps somebody coming in outside and playing the role of an employee. So it's just kind of a diagram, passive attack idea of you know Bob is talking to Alice, but Darth is reading the contents of all of the traffic that's going between the two, and Bob and Alice are none the wiser. Active attacks, you know, um, this case, one of the scenarios we've got here would be you can capture, you know, our hacker here is capturing the message, and then what can be done, that same message can be then replayed back, and maybe perhaps modified and then replayed back and to kind of take the form of an attack. A couple other different classes of cyber attacks, close in, physical proximity. Physical proximity has always been a key factor in security, physical security, and the protection of data resources. If you have access to the console of a computer, you're um, pretty far along in terms of being able to gain access and being able to attack that system. All right, so the idea of physical security is a big issue. Um, Distribution, the idea of being able to take an internal communication network and distribute a malicious code or malware, as we would call it, malware, to multiple across an entire network. Basically per, leveraging the trusted relationship between um, systems and networks to use that as a pathway to be able to send information across. Uh, we talk around this idea of a denial of service, distributed denial of service. Basically, the concept behind it, denial of service, is basically a to attack a communication or a computer operation in such a fashion so that that is not accessible, it is not usable by clients. All right, so there's a lot of different techniques. Our list we have here: volumetric, which is basically massive. The idea of basically massive volume saturating a system. Asymmetric, computational, and vulnerability-based attacks to deny availability for legitimate users. So basically, if you were to, and this is more of a kind of a malicious attack. Basically shutting down an operation, damaging an operation, disrupting an operation. Idea of a layered defense. So, part of what we've got here is we take a look at our, the different classes: passive, active, insider, close-in, distribution. There are different things we can do. So we have a line of defense, like an initial line of defense. However, the challenge is, a single line of defense may or may not be adequate. And I think in most modern security models, the idea of, we would call it a kind of a hard exterior shell, but not providing secondary defenses, is is not a best practice. It's not basically what, a lot of organizations have been compromised by basically putting all of the defenses up front, but no defenses behind. So the idea of having a multi-layered defense, where you have a first layer of defense, and then behind that you have secondary layers of defenses. All right, so you'll be able to run a both primary, secondary, tertiary types of defenses, and it's not really limited to even two. So this idea of a layer can be as many layers as could be effective and cost efficient and effective. Talk just a little bit more about denial of service. The express purpose. It's designed. They're designed for the express purpose of preventing users from accessing and preventing authorized users to be able to do stuff. The idea of I think the ultimate hacker dream is to figure a way to turn off the internet, which is pretty challenging because the internet actually has a lot of mechanisms that are in it, at least from a survivability, and it's difficult to turn the whole thing off because it's such a distributed operation. But focused on a particular organization can do pretty significant damage to an organization. So the idea of exploiting vulnerabilities, focused on resources. So denial by consumption, disruption, and reservation. And so these types of DDoS, or denial of service attacks, take all sorts of forms. They're very common. Here's just some examples of different types of techniques. One of the things that's happened is there's a lot of these attacks that we see here are really adapting features that are built into the network protocol. So network protocols like TCP/IP, basically taking those standard features and turning them, basically weaponizing them. So this idea of a ping flood, there's a thing called a ICMP, Internet Message Protocol, or AKA a ping request. And what it does is sends a packet. It basically sends a request packet to a system. When it receives it, it will respond back with information. So this can be all. Pings can be used for all sorts of things. It can be used for reconnaissance, but it can also be used in different situations for machines that are vulnerable. Something called a ping of death. So what will happen is you can send a ping to a machine, and if it's vulnerable, it will crash. All right, so that's or you can just simply send a volume of pings to a machine that will basically tie the machine up. All right. Some other attacks, smurfing, basically uses a ping request, leveraging a function built into TCP/IP called broadcasting. So what you do is you basically are blasting out broadcast messages across the entire network. Once again, it's a leveraging of an existing, the weaponizing of an existing functionality inside of a network. SYN floods, there's a functionality inside of TCP/IP where to make chain, from a communication perspective, there's a three-way communication, synchronization between two parties to make sure that traffic, when using TCP/IP, that the traffic is verified, that it was received, and it will be retransmitted if it wasn't received properly. So there's a communication. It involves an acknowledgement, basically the sending of a message and acknowledgement of a message. SYN floods basically, adapt that and just simply flood with bogus acknowledgments. If you can imagine from a network perspective, these communications are simply, we send stuff is communicated in packets. Packet is just a bit of information with a particular format. So you can create and introduce, fake or malicious packets and send them, as attack mechanisms across a network. Some other ones as well, Fraggle. A lot of this stuff. So if you look at networking, there's two types of networking, within kind of we use in the internet. One is TCP/IP, which is what we talked about. The other one is called UDP, which is basically does not require, it's a has a lower overhead because it does not have all of the synchronization functionality TCPI has. But basically the same types of attacks. So Fraggle is a UDP um, Smurf attack. And Land is a uh, synchronization. So there's a lot of different types. Teardrop, basically breaking UDP packets up into smaller pieces, and then basically introducing corrupted packets into the mix. Um, Bonk is Bonk and Boink are basically attacks designed using networking specifically against Microsoft Windows machines. Backdoor attacks, this idea of being able to enter a machine, outside of the normal authorization authentication mechanisms. Um, take all sorts of different forms. Ideally, what a hacker will do, if once they get access to a machine, they will actually deploy a set of backdoor mechanisms, which basically means that machine will be really is fully compromised. If a machine is if a hacker is to get into a machine and can come back in and do whatever they want, your best bet, really your only mechanism is to really kind of take that machine off the network and reinstall um, the operating system. So a couple well-known back orifice. Basically, in this case, it leverages a administration of some maintenance protocols that are built into systems for administrative tasks, basically compromising that. NetBus, does this specifically for Windows. Sub 7. So there's a number of these out here, but it's a well-known attack approach used by hackers. Spoofing address, once again, basically the idea is you pretend you're a trusted system and attempt to gain access leveraging those credentials. So spoofing, a lot of techniques around basically sending fake packets, or taking information, creating a packet that appears to be legitimate, and sending it down, and sending it in into looking to compromise weaknesses. DNS, domain name service. The trick here with DNS, the way internet works is um, the names that we see, like www.newyorktimes.com, nytimes.com, for example, is is just simply for people's purposes. All right, and what happens is there's a mechanism inside of uh, networking within the internet and TCP/IP. Something uses something called a domain name service, which translates that name into an address. All right, so everything on the internet has a network address, which enables you to get to it. Um, DNS spoofing, basically what it will do is it will give you can enter a IP address, or you can enter a name like www New York Times or www.google.com or whatever, and what you can do is you intercept that request for the translation and then put your own, and you return back a bogus address. It should take you to a fake site, which will look just like the existing site. So this is a pretty, this can be pretty sneaky. So the idea of, when you have compromises like that, the ability for somebody to, you know, understand what is, when you're going to something on the internet, how do you know that is the legitimate site? So, so man in the middle attacks, pretty well known approaches. Actually, been very successful. Has been very effective in a lot of situations, a lot of scenarios. Basically, a machine will sit between two parties, gather information, either use it for gather information, either use it downstream for a replay attack, or basically being able to, um, basically take the place of that party on the other side. Mathematical attacks, the idea of basically decrypting stuff. Um, for the most part, you don't see a lot of mathematical attacks because so long as you're using a reasonably strong encryption technique. Now, what's happened is you know encryption is been around for a while. However, what's happened is the ability to maintain security, has required, to change different types of encryption techniques and improve the strength of the encryption, so you can't, basically use a regular, some form of mathematical attack or something like that against it. The challenge you ultimately is to make sure you're using like a higher, like a 128 bit. Actually, it used to be 128 bit. Now the best practice is probably 256. Encryption. If you use a lower end, not as effective encryption technique, we're starting to see now that the ability to take your standard processors and be able to actually, it might take a day or so, but to be able to do decryption attacks, effective encryption attacks against um, an encrypted resource. So this idea of making sure that you've got an effective, high level, you know, adequate, what do we call it, adequate. A lot of the early on wireless um, encryption techniques were very, had only like 64-bit encryption, which is actually is at this point now is can be successfully attacked. But if you're at a high enough level, if you've got a high enough level of encryption, I mean that's pretty. I think we're good for now. But once again, uh, this this story continues to evolve and change. Password attacks. These take all sorts of factors. The idea of that a password becomes the mechanism, something somebody knows that you can be, basically you present as a credential to authenticate yourself against to log into it, to a resource or to a systems. Uh, Problem is that you really need to make a password that is efficient and effective. A lot of different attacks, like for example, what we call a dictionary attack. A dictionary attack, basically you take every word in the dictionary, you write a program, and take all the words, and basically use that word, go through the entire dictionary and apply those words um, to see if you can, basically if any of them match. Um, there's a lot of words in the dictionary, but you can write a program that could probably run through them within, with maybe a 45 minutes or an hour. Process all the words and use every word in the dictionary to try to log in. The problem, um, this is actually fairly easy to combat. Basically, what you do is you deactivate an attempt. You deactivate an account if you get X number of invalid login attempts. So, but if you do not put any sort of limitation on the numbers of consecutive login failures, and I mean then a dictionary attack or a password guessing attack would be um, a valid approach. Brute force dictionary. So these are sort of different approaches we have. We've seen a lot of stuff here, like this last one here, password cracking. There's programs that are designed to basically um, like Lafayette crack and other types of really a lot of the stuff was designed to go against Windows machines because that was actually the longest while they, it was a pretty well known. It's pretty well known their security mechanisms. A lot of their vulnerabilities were pretty well known as well. So you saw a lot of organizations basically going up and taking the password file and then decrypting, basically beginning to go through and ultimately decrypt the password files. So, but so they're you don't they're not necessarily common, but if an organization does not do a good job on in establishing password management policies, it still can be a very effective attack. So the top threats, basically what we see in our world right now, malicious code, worms, and trojans. Um, Web-based attacks, as we talk around, as we talked about that, the redirection of browsers to different websites. Um, Web application and injection attacks, the idea of looking for certain techniques, um, programming techniques for websites which can be exploited. So the idea would be what somebody discovered is that if you don't code something, if you don't take care in addressing in verifying the lengths of fields, it is possible to send a very long string of characters into a field and then basically leverage that as a either as an injection or a buffer overflow um, type of attack, which would then enable an attacker to gain control of the machine. Basically, it would um, there's a number of different techniques of this. Injection attacks, basically the ability to go against a database, compromise a database and gain control of the database through a website. These do work. Actually, it's been interesting. They're very well known. They're very well documented, and they still work. So some other threats we see: botnets. Be leveraging of internet-based resources. We see a lot of things now. Everything is connected to the internet and has a processor could potentially become part of a botnet. Um, Denial of service, which has always been out there. Vulnerability of attacks. Leveraging, either from a volume, asymmetric, computational. Spam, unwanted messages. Uh, Spam has been out there for a while. There has been tremendous amount of efforts to try to get rid of spam, but spam lives on no matter what the techniques that have been used so far. Phishing, basically a focused attack, very effective in a lot of cases, using a combination of a spoofed email and counter websites to lure customers into either going to a malicious site or clicking something and then inobtrusively installing a malware which can then be used to compromise their machine. Exploit kits, a lot of stuff that's out there now, automated. A lot of the stuff is automated. A lot of the stuff is just basically anybody can get on Google can look up a lot of stuff. Um, Data breaches, we see a lot of data breaches, which take all sorts of different forms. But the thing we have now is since we can generate so much data and store so much data, if you compromise the security of that data, you can basically have vast volumes of data. A hacker can gain access to vast volumes of data. Physical damage, which is as we talked about, physical is always every sometimes this gets overlooked in the world. The physical is always a challenge. And then insiders, as we talked about, the ability of somebody on the inside, a individual who may be trusted, who may use that trust in a way to disrupt operations or to in that being able. And actually, this can the thing with the other thing is about insider threats. Some of the stuff can be intentional. Some of the stuff can just simply be unintentional. It can be user errors, which is it can also be an insider threat. So a lot of this stuff these threats take all sorts of different forms. And finally, information leakage. We talked about being able to gather information. One of the things that's been really interesting is especially with the rise of social media, the ability to gather large bits of information, be able to aggregate things from different sources to be able to discover a lot of very interesting. You can establish a very comprehensive profile of people based from very disparate bits of information. That could be available on social networks of different types. Identity threat has been around for some period of time, but basically we define it here as collecting personal identifying information. So it's credentials, personal profiling, financial identification, credit cards, things of that nature. Um, Cyber espionage, which is actually we've seen this in a number of situation, especially with state actors. So the ability of one country to attack another country through um, cyber networks, which I think is becoming something I think we've seen over the past couple of years, and awareness of what the potential of this stuff is, or actually what may have happened. I think in the 2016 election. Um, and then finally, ransomware, rogueware, scareware, basically a technique where kind of a low level kind of criminal activity, but basically, you can compromise a machine, um, use encryption, basically encrypt the contents of somebody's hard drive and then hold it ransom, basically until, basically giving them the key only to allow them to decrypt it only after they paid a fee. Um, there's a term that you'll hear a lot in information security. This idea of attack vectors, cyber attack vectors. Basically, it's a means. When we talk about attack vector, it's a means by which somebody is going to attack, a method and an approach. So, there's attack information, attack targets, drive-by attacks, strategic web compromise. Things we call APTs. So APTs are the modern, really what we're seeing now is basically very advanced smart malware that's designed to, you know, hide itself, basically, penetrate, um, disguise itself, and basically, a lot of these things can actually be programmable. So the idea is that an attacker, once you have an advanced persistent threat in place, it can be programmed to do stuff. You can actually send commands and have it do different things. But it's designed really to kind of be very inobtrusive. A lot of the stuff you see now in terms of like threat detection is actually through the monitoring and behavior of different um, activities on a network. So we'll look for behaviors of nodes talking to other nodes or doing things that are kind of may seem will match a pattern of how a known threat will is uh, is operating. Right? So there's a lot of different attack vectors. I mean, just when you think you've got everything down, there's more to come up. The idea of when we introduced smartphones, if security people had enough challenges, as we, just with the introduction of PCs and network PCs, and then um, the idea of first wireless networking, which kind of blew up from a security perspective, changed the whole dynamic, and then on top of that, we introduced like smartphones on top of that. So this idea of the types of ways you can be attacked, the different type of attack vectors that are open to somebody, uh, pretty wide ranging. So just kind of an example here of the different threat landscape. A lot of the stuff is a lot of the stuff we see is like constant monitoring. So we're looking for activities. A lot of the stuff now is driven by behaviors. Where something looks like it's doing something, or it matches a pattern of activity or a pattern of behaviors, which then can be tracked back and or may match to some sort of malware or malware behavior. Emerging threats, cyber physical systems. Basically, we're starting to see, the idea of introducing um, internet-based connections, um, into devices across the board. The idea of like in manufacturing. So it used to be manufacturing systems were totally isolated. Now what's happened is things like those types of networks, internal networks, is a big, that things are the line between uh, corporate computing and manufacturing computing is really the line is blurred. So it's now all of a sudden these idea of cyber physical systems are something that becomes a big area of interest from an attacker and from a defender's perspective. We talked about mobile computing, the idea of what it can introduce in terms of attack vectors. Cloud computing is, the ability, basically cloud computing from a definitional perspective is type of a form of computing where we're accessing resources of different types, so compute resources, storage resources across the internet. And one of the big risks or concerns around that is, there's a lot of capability, security capability built into cloud computing. So it's inherently not necessarily, less secure than running things on premise. There's two problems. Number one is it has to be implemented, has to be utilized. And number two, if you all your resources are maintained on a cloud and the cloud itself got compromised, that could be a major problem. Trust infrastructures, being able to trust who should be trusted on what means and what credentials would be needed to verify and monitor that trust. Uh, Big data, we're seeing more and more large volumes of data. The idea of compromising or contaminating a large data set. What will happen is a lot of these algorithms are designed, assumes that um, you can do all sorts of calculations around big data. However, it's only as good as the data itself. So if a compromised data has bad data in it, basically can really do some really disrupt what you would be doing in terms of an analytics program using big data. Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is this idea from a commercial perspective, everything having internet connectivity and access into it. So your television, your refrigerator, your washer dryer, basically household, household um, components, household infrastructure now suddenly becomes connected onto the network. One of the challenges we're seeing is that a lot of organizations have been moving ahead and introducing technology for Internet of Things, but not necessarily putting adequate security in place to protect that stuff. So that's a huge concern. And finally, sort of similar to cloud computing, network virtualization, software-defined networks. The idea where what you've got is a lot of your networks and compute resources are actually virtualized. So you've got what used to be physical infrastructure is replicated inside of a computer system environment, which is really the same thing as what we see inside of a cloud. So there's a lot of work that's been done, kind of analyzing and kind of watching how organizations how an attacker does attack and kind of the different approaches. So this is the kind of the basic how-to if you're going to compromise, this idea of a multi-phased approach. Starting off reconnaissance, obviously identify and selects targets, weaponize, what you're going to be using to attack with, deliver, exploit, install. Basically the compromising of a resource, then command and control, channel. Once you get in, then to establish it, protect it, act on your objectives, and then basically do whatever you whatever you're set out to do. Um, some of the stuff basically just translates to from another set of steps. You know, Footprinting basically it's kind of the same thing as we say here around reconnaissance. Enumeration, making active corrections to target system direct queries. A lot of the work that gets done, from a hacker's perspective, is really just understanding and kind of reconnaissance of what's happening, how are things set up, what are the types of systems, and then developing a strategy based upon what you see. All right. So footprinting, enumeration are kind of your basic fundamental building blocks on this stuff. Gaining access, depending upon what you have, how it could be compromised. Escalation of privileges. Basically that is the holy grail for a hacker. Once you get in, to be able to make yourself a systems administrator. Full access. Basically, you gain full access and control. Maintaining access. So the idea was talking about adding backdoors. Once a attacker has compromised a machine, then basically you can that machine can be his as long as he desires. Networking exploitation, similar with you know similar, very similar in terms of like what we do and kind of these other forms of attacks. And then finally, this covering of tracks. Basically, what a hacker will do once you get in, once they get in, and once the systems are compromised, then what you do is you want to make sure that nobody knows what you've done. All right. So the idea is the approaches of like erasing log files and hiding files and doing all sorts of things to make it look like the system has not been compromised. And that is it for our first section of the course.